The first time Rosa Prescott saw Stephen Brenner, he was bleeding from a gash above his left eye and still somehow grinning like he had not a care in the world. And she nearly dropped the bucket of water she had been hauling across the dry, sun-cracked yard of her late father's cattle ranch in Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, in the summer of 1882. She had not asked for company. She had not asked for a drifting cowboy to appear at the edge of her property on a bay roan horse, with a saddle scuffed down to the raw leather, and a battered hat pulled low over a pair of the most honest brown eyes she had ever seen in her 24 years of living. She had not asked for any of it, and yet there he was, swaying just slightly in the saddle, one large hand pressed to the side of his head where the blood ran thin and copper-colored down toward his jaw. "You need something," Rosa called out, her voice flat, her posture straight as a fence post. She set the bucket down without spilling a drop and shaded her eyes against the brutal July sun. "Water if you have it," the man said, and his voice was deep and unhurried, like a river that had decided long ago it would get where it was going without rushing. "My horse needs it more than I do, though." Rosa studied him for a moment. She had learned in the years since her father died and left her alone on 60 acres of dry New Mexico land with 3 cattle, a mule named Chester, and a mortgage that sat on her chest like a stone, that caution was the price of survival. Men who showed up unannounced could be anything. Drifters, outlaws, men from the bank, which in many ways was worse. But the horse did look pitiful, its sides heaving, its head hanging low in the afternoon heat. "Trough is around the side," she said, pointing. "You can water the horse, then you can move on." He touched the brim of his hat. "Yes, ma'am, thank you." He slid from the saddle with the practiced ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times, though the moment his boots hit the ground he caught himself against the horse's flank, and Rosa saw the way his jaw tightened against the pain he refused to announce. "You are going to fall over," she said, not unkindly but not kindly either. "I have been falling over since I was 4 years old," he said, leading the horse around the side of the house. "I have gotten very good at getting back up." Rosa stood in the yard for a moment after he disappeared around the corner, telling herself she was going back inside. She had bread to check on the stove and accounts to review that would not improve no matter how many times she looked at them. She had things to do, and none of them included a bleeding cowboy. She followed him around the side of the house. He had his hat off by the time she rounded the corner, and the roan was drinking deeply from the trough while he crouched beside the water, scooping handfuls up over the wound on his temple. Without the hat she could see he was not old. Late 20s, perhaps. Dark hair that curled slightly at the ends from sweat, a jaw that carried a few days of stubble, wide shoulders inside a faded blue shirt with a tear along the collar seam. "What happened to you?" she asked, leaning against the corner of the house with her arms crossed. "Disagreement," he said, not looking up. "With what?" "With a man named Garrett Hale who did not appreciate me telling him he was cheating at cards." "Were you right?" He looked up at her then, and there was that grin again, lopsided and impossible to fully distrust. "I was absolutely right. Cost me $20 in this." He tapped the gash above his eye, "but I was right." "Being right is a poor comfort when you are bleeding," Rosa said. "Spoken like a woman who has been right about something expensive," he said. She did not answer that because she had been, more times than she could count, and it had never once made anything easier. She pushed off the wall and went inside and came back with a strip of clean linen and a small tin of the salve she made from yarrow and pine resin that her mother had taught her to make before her mother too had gone from this world. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the overturned crate beside the trough. He sat without argument, which she respected, and she cleaned the cut with brisk, efficient hands, trying not to notice that he smelled of horse and sun-warmed leather, and something underneath that was just clean skin, which was more than she could say for most men who came through Cimarron. "Stephen Brenner," he said, as if they were being formally introduced in a parlor somewhere instead of crouching in the dirt beside a horse trough in the baking heat. "I know who you are," Rosa said, wrapping the linen around his head and tying it. He blinked. "Do you?" My father hired you twice, 3 years ago and again the spring before he died. You helped move the Prescott herd to Raton. I was 17 the first time. I remember faces. He looked at her with new recognition spreading slowly across his features. Henry Prescott's girl. Henry Prescott's daughter, she corrected, pulling the linen tight enough to make him wince. Rosa, and this is my ranch now. He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet was a kind of genuine respect that she had not expected, and that did something uncomfortable to the wall she kept carefully built around her chest. I heard he passed, Stephen said. I am sorry, he was a good man. He was, Rosa said, stepping back and wiping her hands on her skirt. Now you have water and a bandage, Mr. Brenner. Where are you headed? Nowhere in particular. That is a dangerous kind of answer in this territory. I suppose it is. He stood and settled his hat back on carefully, mindful of the bandage. He looked around at the yard, at the small house with its peeling paint, at the Lenta stable that held Chester and the 3 remaining cattle. She watched him taking it in, and she waited for the pity, the way men had a habit of looking at her situation like it was a tragedy she needed rescuing from. But he just said, "You are running this place alone." "I am." "Do you need a hand?" "No," she said immediately. He nodded, accepting that without debate, and that surprised her more than anything else so far. He gathered up his horse's reins. "Well, thank you for the water and the bandage, Miss Prescott." "It is Mrs. Prescott," she said, and then wished she had not, because now he would ask and she would have to explain, and she did not want to explain. But he did not ask. He just nodded again, more slowly this time, and swung up into the saddle with that same fluid ease. "Good evening to you, then." He rode south toward town, and Rosa watched him until the dust closed over him. And then she went back inside to her bread and her accounts, and told herself very firmly that she had not noticed a single thing about him, beyond the fact that he was not her problem. The accounts told their usual grim story. She was 3 months behind on the mortgage payment to the First Territorial Bank of Cimarron, which was operated by a man named Aldous Fitch, who had already sent 2 letters that she had read, and then folded very small and pushed to the back of the kitchen drawer where she kept things she was not ready to face. The ranch had 60 acres, but the grazing land was dry from 2 seasons of poor rain, and 3 cattle were not a herd. They were barely a gesture toward a herd. She had been selling what she could, taking in mending work from the women in town, selling eggs from her 6 chickens, and it was not enough. It was never quite enough. She lay awake that night listening to the coyotes calling to each other across the dark mesa, thinking about Stephen Brenner's easy grin, and the way he had said nowhere in particular, like a man who had made his peace with being untethered. And she thought about her own father, who had loved this land with everything he had, and left it to her knowing it might swallow her whole, because he had also believed she was the only person strong enough to survive it. She was not sure, on nights like this, that he had been right. 2 days later, Stephen Brenner rode back onto the Prescott Ranch at 6 in the morning, carrying a sack of oats for Chester, and a string of 4 fresh-caught trout from the Cimarron River. Rosa was at the well when he came through the gate, and she straightened up slowly and looked at him with an expression she had practiced carefully, the one that said she was not surprised and not pleased, and that he should explain himself quickly. "I had too much time on my hands," he said, hanging the trout over the saddle horn. "And the hardware man in town told me your fence line on the east side has been down for a month." "It has," Rosa said. "I have been getting to it." "I can fix it today," he said. "I'm not asking for pay, I just—" He paused, and she saw him searching for the right thing to say, which she appreciated more than a man who had the wrong thing ready. "I knew your father. It would feel right to do something useful." Rosa studied him. The bandage was gone, and the cut above his eye had closed into a thin, dark line that would scar. He looked rested and steady, nothing like the bleeding man who had appeared 2 days ago. "You put those fish in the kitchen and you can fix the fence," she said. "There is coffee on the stove." It became a pattern before either of them formally acknowledged it. Stephen rode out to the Prescott Ranch 3 or 4 mornings a week through July and into August, and he fixed the east fence, and then the north fence post that had been listing since March, and he helped her move the 3 cattle to the better grazing on the creek side, and he repaired the hinge on the stable door and rechinked the gaps in the lean-to wall that had been letting in the cold night air. Rosa made coffee and fed him breakfast and tried very hard to keep things businesslike, which was made difficult by the fact that Stephen Brenner was not a businesslike kind of person. He was warm and funny in a quiet, unexpected way, prone to saying things that caught her completely off guard, while doing something entirely ordinary like hauling fence posts or brushing the roan down. What was his name? He asked one morning at the end of August, coming into the kitchen still dusty from a morning's work, and pouring himself coffee with the comfortable ease of a man who had long since stopped being a guest. He said it looking at the small, silver-framed photograph on the mantel, the one that showed Rosa at 21 in a church dress beside a young man with a serious expression. Rosa set down her knife and the potato she had been peeling. "James Prescott," she said. "No relation. It was a coincidence that made the preacher laugh. We were married in 1879. He died the following spring. Fever." "I am sorry," Stephen said. 3 years ago," she said. "I have made my peace with it." "Have you?" he asked, not unkindly, just genuinely, like a man who was actually interested in the true answer and not the polite one. She picked up the potato again. "I have made enough peace with it to still be here." He was quiet a moment, then said, "That is actually more impressive than the other kind of peace." She looked up at him then, and he was watching her over the rim of his coffee cup with those honest brown eyes, and she felt something move in her chest that she immediately and firmly refused to examine. "Eat your breakfast," she said. "Those fence posts are not going to set themselves." In September, trouble arrived in the form of Aldous Fitch, who came out to the ranch in his black buggy with his clerk beside him and a document in his soft, carefully uncalloused hands. He was a small man in his 40s who wore his authority like an expensive coat. He was always afraid of creasing. He informed Rosa, in a voice arranged to sound regretful but carrying underneath it a bedrock of satisfaction, that the bank was prepared to foreclose on the Prescott Ranch in 30 days unless the outstanding balance of $240 was paid in full. Rosa stood in the yard in the September sun and looked at the document and kept her face very still. "The property is worth considerably more than the mortgage," she said. "You know that." "The value of the property is not the issue, Mrs. Prescott. The terms of the mortgage are the issue. I need 60 days. 30 is what the bank is prepared to offer." "And I will need 30 days," Rosa said, handing the document back to him. "I will have your money, Mr. Fitch." He took the paper back with the faint smile of a man who did not believe her and did not care either way. He climbed back into his buggy and rolled back toward town, and Rosa stood in the yard until the dust settled, and then sat down on the porch steps because her legs had gone slightly unsteady. Stephen came around from the back of the house where he had been working on the stable roof. He looked at her face, then looked down the road where the buggy had gone. "Bank," he said. "Bank," she confirmed. He sat down beside her on the steps without being invited, and she did not tell him to move. "How bad?" she told him. $240 in 30 days on a ranch that was barely clearing $30 a month in sales and mending work. She said it all plainly without drama because drama did not make numbers change. Stephen was quiet for a long moment. "I have been saving," he said carefully. "No," Rosa said immediately. "Rosa, no, Stephen." She said his name firmly and heard, somewhere in the back of her mind, that it was the first time she had used it. "I am not taking money from you. That is not something I will do." "I was not offering charity," he said just as firmly. "I was going to suggest a business arrangement." She looked at him sideways. "You need money," he said. "I have been looking for a place to put down roots. I am good with cattle and I know this land. I could buy a partnership interest in this ranch, equal stakes. You keep the land, I put in capital, we split the work and the profit." He paused. "It is just business." "Stephen Brenner," Rosa said slowly, "you have known me for 2 months." "I know," he said. "And you have been riding out here fixing fences and eating my cooking without asking anything in return. And now, you want to invest $240 in a ranch with 3 cattle and 1 mule. 4 cattle, he said. I bought another one last week. She is in the south pasture. I was going to mention it. Rosa stared at him. You bought me a cow. I bought the ranch a cow, he said, and there was the slightest flush along the back of his neck that he was doing his best to ignore. It is an investment in the business. She looked away across the dry golden grass of the south pasture and thought about pride and about stubbornness and about her father, who had always said that the strongest thing a person could do was know the difference between the help that diminished you and the help that made you more. Equal stakes, she said finally. You pay the mortgage debt and the cost of that cow you apparently already bought, and in return you own half of this ranch with full rights and full responsibilities. Everything is in writing, a proper legal document drawn up in town. Agreed, he said. And this does not mean anything else, she added, and she heard herself say it and wished she sounded more certain. Stephen looked at her with those quiet brown eyes and he said, Whatever you say, Rosa. He did not smile when he said it. He just said it straight, which somehow made it worse. The document was drawn up by the town solicitor, a methodical man named Crawford who did not comment on the unusual arrangement, but wrote everything out precisely and had both parties sign it. Stephen paid Aldous Fitch the full balance the following Monday, and Rosa stood beside him in the bank and watched Fitch take the money with a small contracted look of disappointment that gave her more satisfaction than anything had in months. Walking out of the bank into the bright New Mexico September morning, Rosa said, He wanted that land. Men like Fitch always want what other people have built, Stephen said, tucking his copy of the receipt into his shirt pocket. He will try again, she said. I know, Stephen said. We will be ready. That we settled into Rosa's chest somewhere unexpected, and she did not dislodge it, not that day. The autumn that followed was the hardest and most alive Rosa had felt in years. Stephen moved his few possessions into the bunkroom attached to the stable, because that was proper, and she had made very clear there was nothing romantic happening here, and he accepted this with the same uncomplaining steadiness he brought to everything else. Together they expanded the herd slowly, picking up 2 more cattle from a rancher outside Raton who was selling off his smaller animals before winter, and they worked the fence lines and repaired the irrigation channel that fed water from the creek to the south pasture, and they brought in hay from the town merchant for the lean months. They fell into rhythms. Rosa was up before the sun, and Stephen was not far behind her, and there was coffee and the particular quiet of early morning that they shared without needing to fill it, which was something Rosa had not known she missed until she had it again. He was not a man who talked for the sake of sound. When he said something, it was because he meant it, and she had learned to trust his words the way she trusted the fence posts he set, firmly and for the long term. But it was not simple. Nothing worth anything is ever simple. There were evenings when they sat on the porch watching the sun go down behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, turning the sky every impossible color at once. And the silence between them was not the comfortable silence of business partners, but something with more weight to it, something that had a pulse. And Rosa would get up and go inside because she did not know what to do with that kind of silence, and she had told herself very plainly that she did not intend to find out. She had loved James, in the way of young people who are more in love with the idea of a life together than with the actual complexity of each other, and when he died, she had grieved him genuinely. But it was the years after that had shaped her into the woman she was now. 3 years of hauling her own water and making her own decisions, and finding out that she was exactly capable of surviving on her own, and there was a freedom in that she had not expected and did not want to surrender. Because love, in her experience, was a thing that required you to depend on someone, and dependence was a door she had locked from the inside. One evening in October, after they had spent a long day driving the herd to better winter grazing and come back sore and tired and more at ease with each other than she had planned to let happen, she said it out loud for the first time. They were at the kitchen table, working through the month's accounts together, which was a ritual now, and there was a lamp between them and the window was dark, and the smell of the coffee she had just made was warm in the room. Stephen was looking over the numbers with a quiet frown, making notes on the margin of the ledger, and she watched him for a moment without meaning to and then looked away and said what she had been thinking about for weeks. "I want to be honest with you," she said. He looked up. "I know what has been happening," she said, "between us, and I want you to know that it is not something I intend to act on. Not because of you, because of—" She searched for the right word. "Because love is a foolish gamble, Stephen. I have seen too many people throw everything they have on it and come up with nothing." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. The lamp flame leaned in a small draught from somewhere. Stephen looked at her for a long time without speaking, and she could not read all of what was behind those eyes, but she could read enough to know he was not going to pretend she had not said it. Then he said, "Then I am the biggest fool alive." He said it so simply, so completely without self-pity or performance, that she felt the words hit her somewhere behind the sternum like something physical. "Stephen, I am not asking you to change your mind," he said, and went back to the ledger. "I am just telling you the truth of it. You wanted honesty. That is mine." Rosa sat there looking at the side of his face and did not know what to say to a man who had just offered her everything, and then turned back to the accounts like he was prepared to be patient about it forever. She went to bed that night and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. The next morning was the same as every morning: coffee and early light and the sound of Stephen in the stable seeing to the horses. And the morning after that was the same, and he did not bring it up, and he did not withdraw from her, and he did not treat her any differently. And that was almost harder to manage than if he had done any of those things. She found herself noticing things she had been carefully not noticing before. The way he talked to Chester the mule like the animal could understand every word and probably agreed with most of it. The way he fixed things not just until they were functional, but until they were genuinely good, as if everything he put his hands to deserved his full attention. The way he had a book in his saddlebag, a worn copy of Washington Irving's Tales that he read in the evenings by the stable lamp, and the way he was not embarrassed about reading it. She noticed that he hummed sometimes while working, low and tuneless, and that he stopped when he thought anyone could hear him. She noticed that he was 28 years old and had been moving from place to place since he was 16, and that the expression on his face when he looked out over the Prescott land was the expression of a man who had finally, against his better expectations, found the thing he had been looking for without knowing he was looking. In November, a man named Cole Dutton arrived in Cimarron. He was a cattle broker from Amarillo, broad and florid-faced, with a manner that was aggressively charming in the way of men who mistake noise for warmth. He had heard there was a small ranch outside town, recently back on solid footing, running a modest but healthy herd, and he came out to make an offer. Rosa and Stephen sat across the kitchen table from him and listened to the offer, which was fair for the cattle but attached to conditions about future grazing rights that were not fair at all and would effectively limit where they could expand the herd over the next 5 years. Rosa said no. Cole Dutton pressed. Rosa said no again, in a different way that was quieter but considerably more final. Cole Dutton, who was not accustomed to no from a woman, shifted his attention to Stephen with the unspoken suggestion that the real decision-maker ought to be involved. Stephen looked at him pleasantly and said, "This is Mrs. Prescott's ranch. Her no is my no." Dutton left without his deal, and Rosa watched him go and felt something warm and sure settle in her chest, and tried to attribute it to the satisfaction of a good business decision, and could not quite make it stick. That evening she sat on the porch alone after Stephen had gone in to read, and she looked at the stars, which were extraordinary out here, dense and brilliant in the cold November sky, no city light anywhere for miles to dilute them. She thought about the life she had built, the one she had fought for and continued fighting for. She thought about how it had changed since August, how it was both more difficult and more alive than it had been in years. She thought about the biggest fool alive sitting in the stable reading Washington Irving. She went and knocked on the stable door. He opened it holding his book, lamp light behind him, and his expression was careful and calm, a man who had gotten very good at not hoping out loud. "I have been thinking about what you said," Rosa told him. "Which part?" he said. "All of it," she said. "About the gamble." She paused. She was not a woman who did this kind of thing easily, said the hard, true thing without editing it first, but she had decided tonight that she was going to be as honest with him as he had been with her. "I am afraid," she said, "not of you specifically, of what it costs. Of needing someone that much, of building something good and then losing it." She pressed her lips together for a moment. "I have lost too many people I counted on, my mother, my father, James. It does not get easier to rebuild." Stephen did not move from the doorway, did not come toward her the way another man might have, crowding the moment. He just listened. "But I have also been sitting in this house telling myself I am being wise and practical," she continued, "and what I have actually been doing is being scared, and I am tired of being scared." She looked up at him. "I am not saying the gamble is not foolish. I still think love is exactly as risky as I said it was." "It is," he agreed quietly. "But you have been honest with me since August," she said. "You have not pretended to be someone you are not or offered me anything you did not mean. And that is," she exhaled slowly, "that is the rarest thing I have ever come across." Stephen set his book on the windowsill and folded his arms and looked at her with an expression that was open in a way that would have made most people feel exposed, but on him looked like a kind of courage. "Rosa," he said, "I am not going anywhere. I have not been going anywhere since the day you made me sit on a crate and tied a bandage around my head. I just needed you to know I was here." "I know you are here," she said. The night was cold and the stars were burning and the Sangre de Cristo mountains were dark shapes against the edge of the sky. "Then I am going to take the gamble," she said. He stepped out of the stable doorway, and the moment he moved toward her she did not step back, which was itself a kind of revolution. And when he took her face in his hands, they were warm despite the cold air, and she thought, quite clearly, that she had been wrong about a great number of things. He kissed her gently, the way of a man who understood that this was something irreversible and wanted to honor it properly, and the world did not fall apart. The ranch was still there, and the cattle were still there, and the mortgage was paid, and everything that had been hard was still hard. But it was not quite so cold. They were careful with it, the way you are careful with something that has not had time to harden yet. Rosa did not change who she was. She remained as self-sufficient and direct as she had always been, and Stephen did not ask her to. What changed was smaller and more significant than a complete transformation. They shared meals at the kitchen table and talked in the evenings about the ranch and about plans, and about the future with the particular pleasure of two people who have found someone whose vision of the future is unexpectedly compatible with their own. He moved out of the bunkroom and into the house in January, when the temperature in the bunkroom had dropped to something that was genuinely dangerous at night, and Rosa made up the second bedroom for him with clean sheets and a good lamp, and told herself this was purely practical, which lasted about 3 days before they both admitted that this was not an entirely practical arrangement. They were married in February of 1883, on a cold, clear day, in the small adobe church in Cimarron, with the preacher who had married Rosa and James, and who smiled at this second ceremony with a warmth that was entirely unironic. There was no party to speak of. Rosa wore her best dress, dark blue wool with white buttons, and Stephen wore his clean shirt and his least battered hat, and they stood before the preacher and said the words that meant they were betting on each other for keeps. Afterward, walking back to the wagon together in the winter sunlight, Rosa said, "Biggest fool alive." Stephen laughed, a real laugh that started in his chest and broke into the cold air, and she thought she could listen to that sound for the rest of her life and call it a good life. He helped her up onto the wagon seat and climbed up beside her, and they drove home along the road that cut through the mesquite and the cold brown grass. And the mountains were white-capped, and the sky was that particular deep blue that only exists in winter over the New Mexico desert. And Rosa leaned her shoulder against his, and let herself feel the full weight of the decision she had made without looking for ways to take it back. Spring came to the Prescott-Brenner ranch, as Rosa had taken to calling it in the ledger, with the particular violence of New Mexico springs. Sudden warm days cut through with cold snaps, the creek running higher from the mountain snowmelt, the dry grass brightening in patches along the creek bank. They planted a kitchen garden behind the house, expanding the small patch Rosa had always maintained, adding more vegetables and a row of herbs, and Stephen built a proper chicken coop to replace the loose board affair that had been housing the chickens in a state of perpetual indignity. They bought 2 more cattle in March and 2 in April, and the herd was now 9 animals, which was not large by any measure but was beginning to feel like something with a real future to it. Stephen had a talent with animals that went beyond skill into something more like conversation. He could read the mood of a steer from 40 feet away and respond accordingly, and the herd was calm and well managed in a way that saved wear on them and on the pasture land both. Rosa had always been good at the business side of ranching, at the numbers and the planning, and together they worked with a complementary efficiency that other ranchers in the area noticed and occasionally commented on. There was a community of small ranchers spread across the Cimarron region, men and women working hard land with varying degrees of success, and the Brenners became part of that community in the natural way of people who show up and do the work and treat their neighbors straight. There was a rancher named Pete Whitfield 2 miles north, a big weathered man in his 50s with a kindly wife named Dolers, who took an immediate and unconditional liking to Rosa, and brought her a jar of green chili preserves on the occasion of learning she was married, and called her Honey from that day on with a maternal warmth that filled a space in Rosa's chest she had not even known was empty. There was also, on the eastern edge of the grazing territory, a persistent problem with cattle from the larger Dunmore operation drifting onto Prescott-Brenner Range and eating the better grasses near the creek. Frank Dunmore was a prosperous rancher who ran several hundred head and managed his boundaries with the casualness of a man who believed that the most important fences were the ones around his larger neighbor's property, not his own. Stephen handled the first 3 incidents with diplomatic patience, riding to the Dunmore place and informing Frank of the strays in a manner that was polite and contained no accusation. Frank was accommodating each time, apologetic and assured that it would not happen again. The 4th time in May, when they found 11 Dunmore cattle eating a full section of their creekside pasture that they had been carefully conserving for the summer, Rosa rode out with Stephen and sat on her horse at the edge of the Dunmore yard, and explained to Frank Dunmore in very plain terms that this was the last diplomatic conversation they would have on the subject, and that the next time his cattle appeared on Prescott-Brenner land, she would be writing directly to the county assessor about the fence line dispute, which had implications for Dunmore's own land claim that he would not enjoy exploring. Frank Dunmore looked at her with a mix of surprise and the particular irritation of a man who had expected this conversation to be easier. Then he looked at Stephen, who was sitting quietly on his horse doing absolutely nothing, and said, "Your wife talks for you now." "My wife is considerably better at this kind of conversation than I am," Stephen said pleasantly. "I would listen to her." The cattle did not drift again. Summer of 1883 was the fullest summer of Rosa's adult life. Not the easiest, because no summer on a working ranch is easy, but full in the way that matters, full of purpose and labor and the satisfaction of things growing and improving under her hands. The garden produced well. The herd was healthy. The fence lines held. The irrigation channel, which Stephen had spent 3 weekends of hard work expanding and reinforcing, was carrying enough water to keep the south pasture green well into August, when the Cimarron Valley typically began its autumn drying. And there was the private world she had built with Stephen, the one that existed inside the house and in the quiet of early morning and in the evenings on the porch. The world of two people who had chosen each other not out of desperation or convention, but out of a genuine recognition of something rare. She had not expected to love him the way she did. She had expected to respect him, to rely on him, to find him good company. She had not expected to find herself sometimes just watching him move across the yard with a feeling in her chest so large and uncomplicated that it frightened her a little, not because it was terrible but because it was so entirely the opposite. She told him that once, sitting on the porch in August with the evening star coming up over the mesa. "I did not expect this," she said. "The ranch." He said because he could be deliberately obtuse when he thought it would make her say the real thing. "You," she said. "This, the whole foolish, improbable thing." He smiled, and it was the same smile as that first day, lopsided and impossible to fully distrust, but different too, warmer, with something settled behind it that had not been there before. "I thought you had decided the gamble was worth it," he said. "I have decided that," she said. "I am just noting for the record that you were right." "About what specifically?" "About being the biggest fool alive." She looked at him sideways. "It is contagious, apparently." He reached over and took her hand, which he did sometimes in these quiet evening moments, simply and without ceremony, and she let him keep it. In September, Rosa realized she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before telling him, turning it over the way she turned over the accounts, examining it from every angle. She was not afraid, exactly. She was more what she would describe as astonished, at the way the future had its own intentions regardless of what you planned for it. She told him on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and the particular golden September light coming through the east window. She said it plainly, as she said most things. Stephen Brenner put down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression that moved through surprise and then something she could only describe as a kind of reverent joy, quiet and enormous, the expression of a man receiving something he had not let himself want too clearly for fear of wanting it too much. "Rosa," he said, and that was all he said for a moment, and it was enough. "It will be spring," she said. "April, the doctor thinks." He stood up and came around the table, and she stood too, and he held her with such careful and absolute tenderness that she felt, quite suddenly, and without warning, like crying, which was not something she did in front of people as a general rule. She did it anyway, just briefly, her face against his shoulder, and he said nothing and held on and let her do it. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly after a moment. "I am more than all right," she said. "I'm just feeling a great many things at once." "That seems fair," he said. She laughed at that, which turned the tears into something better, and when she pulled back she wiped her eyes with her sleeve in an entirely practical manner and said, "We are going to need to expand the house." He said, "I have been thinking about that back room." "I know you have," she said. "You have been looking at it since February," he smiled. "Was I that obvious?" "To me," she said. "Yes." The fall was busy with planning and preparation, alongside the regular work of the ranch. And Stephen began the addition to the house in October, building a proper back room with a real window and solid walls, working in the evenings and on the slower days when the ranch allowed it. And Pete Whitfield came over 2 Saturdays to help with the heavier framing work. And Dolores Whitfield brought soup and declared it all very exciting in a voice that made Rosa feel like she had family again. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was colder than the 2 previous, with real snow falling twice in December and lying on the mesa for days before the sun took it. The cattle needed more attention, more supplemental feed, and the mornings were gray and hard before they lightened into the bright, ice-edged winter days that this country did so well. Rosa's pregnancy was not difficult, but it was demanding in the honest biological way of pregnancies, and she modified her work accordingly, which required more negotiation with her own pride than with her actual physical condition. Stephen was steady as the mountains through all of it. He did not treat her as fragile, which she would have resented, but he also quietly absorbed the heavier physical work without being asked, and without making a performance of the accommodation, which was the precise right balance that she had not thought to ask for and that he somehow knew to provide. Aldous Fitch made one more appearance at the beginning of December, showing up at the ranch in his black buggy with a man she did not recognize, walking the property line on the eastern edge as if he were measuring it for something. Stephen saw them from the back pasture and came in and told her without evident alarm, and they both watched from the house and said nothing. The following week, Stephen rode into town and paid a visit to the county recorder's office and ensured that the Prescott-Brenner deed was properly filed and noted, and then paid a visit to the county sheriff, a solid man named Harmon who had a sensible relationship with both the law and the practical realities of the territory, and had a quiet conversation about Fitch's history with small landholders in the county that the sheriff received with a thoughtful expression and a note in his ledger. Fitch did not come back. His presence in that ledger, Rosa suspected, made the Prescott-Brenner property considerably less interesting to him. January of 1884 was quiet and cold and beautiful in the particular way of deep winter in New Mexico, when the sky was so blue it seemed like a physical pressure, and the air was thin and bright, and the mountains looked close enough to touch. Rosa finished a quilt she had been making in the evenings for the coming baby, dark blue and cream, and hung it over the back of the kitchen chair where she could look at it while she worked. Stephen came in one evening in late January and found her standing at the stove and just stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her, and when she turned around and caught him, he did not look away. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just thinking that I am a very fortunate man." "You are a man standing in a cold doorway letting the heat out," she said, but she was smiling, the small involuntary smile she had given up trying to suppress around him several months ago. He came in and shut the door and helped set the table, and they ate together in the lamplight, with the wind coming down off the mountains and the house warm and sound around them. And Rosa thought about what she had said in October 2 years ago about love being a foolish gamble, and she thought that she had been both completely right and completely wrong. It was a gamble. That part she stood by. There was no certainty in it, no guaranteed return, no protection from loss. Stephen could leave. Stephen could die, as James had died, as her father had died, as her mother had died, and she would be left again in the wreckage of a life she had built around someone else's continued presence. That risk had not disappeared. She had not been wrong about the risk. What she had been wrong about was whether the risk was reason enough not to play. She had confused wisdom with self-protection and dressed fear up in the language of practicality. The gamble was real. It was also, she had discovered, entirely worth making. The baby arrived on the 14th of April, 1884, which was a cool, clear spring morning with the creek running and the cottonwoods coming into their new leaves. And he was a boy, 8 pounds and thoroughly opinionated about his arrival, who Stephen held in the stable light with an expression of such complete and wordless wonder that Rosa, exhausted and triumphant in the bed, started crying again, and this time did not bother to stop. They named him Henry, after Rosa's father, and the name settled over the baby like something that had been waiting to be claimed. Henry Brenner grew through that spring and summer with the particular insistent vitality of a healthy child on a working ranch, and Rosa and Stephen organized their days around him with the creative improvisation that new parenthood demands, finding rhythms, adjusting to the new world that is the one you knew plus one more very small, very loud, enormously important person. Dolores Whitfield became a grandmother in the honorary sense of the word, showing up regularly with food and advice, and the arms of a woman who had raised 3 children of her own and knew exactly how to hold a fussy baby. Pete Whitfield shook Stephen's hand the first time he met Henry and said, "Good work, son," with the brevity of a man who meant it completely. The ranch prospered, slowly and not without setbacks, the way real things prosper, not in dramatic leaps but in the patient accumulation of good decisions and hard work and a certain fundamental willingness to endure the years that test you. They built the herd to 15 cattle by the end of 1884, and to 22 the following year, and Stephen's reputation as a man who knew cattle spread through the ranching community of the Cimarron Valley in the organic way. Such reputation spread, through results, and through the word of people whose own word meant something. There were lean months and difficult seasons. There was a drought in the summer of 1885 that cut the creek flow and required them to haul water to the herd and reduce the herd temporarily and make the careful, unpleasant financial calculations of survival. There was a harsh winter in 1886 that took 3 animals and required significant investment in supplemental feed. There were the ordinary emergencies of frontier life: a horse gone lame, a section of the new fence destroyed by a storm, a year when the kitchen garden failed and the grocery bills were an unwelcome surprise. Through all of it, Rosa's essential character held, and so did Stephen's, and so did the thing between them that she had once called a gamble, and that she had since come to understand was something more durable than odds. In the spring of 1886, with Henry nearly 2 years old and walking with the determined unsteadiness of a child, who has recently discovered that the world is best understood by putting it in your mouth or throwing it at the floor, Rosa told Stephen she was pregnant again. He received this news with the same particular quiet joy as the first time, and also with the more experienced manner of a man who knew what the months ahead would require, and had already begun thinking about how to arrange things so she would not have to ask for help. Their second child arrived in November of 1886, a girl they named Clara, and the house, with its back-room addition and its warm stone hearth and its kitchen full of garden smell and lamp light, felt exactly as full and complex and alive as Rosa had not, in those careful, lonely years after James died, believed it would ever feel again. Henry was absolutely certain that the new baby had been delivered to the ranch, specifically to irritate him, a conviction that softened gradually over the following months into a more complicated and ultimately generous older sibling feeling that expressed itself mainly in the form of bringing Clara small objects that interested him and explaining them to her at length, while she stared at him with wide, unfocused eyes that he took as fascinated attention. Stephen watched these sibling negotiations with the expression of a man who was finding life to be considerably better than he had previously managed to expect of it. There was an evening in December of 1886, Henry nearly 3, Clara 6 weeks old, the house quiet for once because both children were asleep, which was not a state that lasted reliably and was therefore valued completely. Rosa was at the kitchen table with the ledger, not because there was urgency in the accounts, but because the habit of keeping them in order was one of her fundamental pleasures, a way of having the shape of her life clearly visible. Stephen was at the other end of the table with his book, the same Washington Irving that had been his companion for years, the spine now reinforced with a strip of leather he had cut and glued on himself. The lamp was between them, and outside the winter was cold and clear, and the coyotes were calling somewhere far out on the mesa. Rosa looked up from the ledger and looked at him, this man she had bandaged on a summer morning and argued with and relied on and chosen, and felt the full, simple, extraordinary weight of what her life had become. He must have felt her looking because he glanced up from his book. "What is it?" he said. "I was just thinking about what you said," she told him. "In the kitchen." That first time, he knew immediately what she meant. He always knew what she meant, that I was the biggest fool alive. "Yes," she said, "were you right?" He considered this with genuine seriousness, which was one of the things she loved most about him, that he took her questions seriously even when they were the kind most people would deflect with a joke. "No," he said, "I was wrong about that." "Oh," she said. "Fools don't get this lucky," he said, and looked back at his book. Rosa sat with that for a moment, this man and this house and the two children sleeping down the hall and the ranch outside under the winter stars and all the years of work and stubbornness and fear and courage that had gone into making a life worth sitting in. Then she said, "Neither do gamblers as a rule." He smiled without looking up. "No," he said. "As a rule they do not." She went back to the ledger and the lamp burned between them, and the night was cold and the house was warm and it was nothing dramatic, not a sunset or a miracle, just two people at a kitchen table in the New Mexico Territory in December of 1886, which was, she had come to understand, precisely what happiness looked like when it was real. The years that followed were built on that foundation, and they were good years, marked by the particular satisfaction of a life that has found its right shape. The Brenner Ranch, which everyone now called by that name without needing to clarify further, grew to 30 head of cattle by 1888, and Stephen hired a young ranch hand named Leo, a 17-year-old from a local New Mexican family whose family had worked this land long before the American settlement had arrived, and who had a natural talent with horses that surpassed even Stephen's considerable skill. They paid him fairly and treated him decently, and he became, over the years, as permanent a fixture of the ranch as Chester the mule, who was aging now but still functional and still deeply opinionated about all of it. Henry grew from a toddler into a boy of fierce intelligence and limitless energy, shadowing Stephen around the ranch from the time he could keep pace, absorbing the knowledge of cattle and land and weather, and the 1,000 small competencies that made a rancher. He had Rosa's directness and Stephen's patience, which was a potent combination that occasionally drove his teachers in the Cimarron schoolhouse to the edges of their own patience. Clara grew quieter and more observant than her brother, a child who watched everything and said less but whose assessments, when delivered, were precise enough to occasionally startle adults into silence. She had Rosa's dark eyes and Stephen's way of waiting for the moment before she spoke, and she attached herself to the kitchen garden at an early age with a devotion that Rosa recognized and celebrated. In the spring of 1889, Rosa found herself pregnant for the third time. She was 30 years old, and the pregnancy was harder than the first two in the way that third pregnancies sometimes are, more fatiguing, more physically demanding, requiring her to hand off more of the ranch work than her nature inclined her to and to spend more time in the house than suited her. But she was not alone in any of it. Stephen was present with a constancy that she had by now stopped being surprised by and simply relied on, as you rely on the creek to run and the sun to rise, not because it is guaranteed, but because the pattern of it has become part of how you understand the world. Dolores Whitfield came over twice a week through the late summer, and Henry, who was 5 now, took on the task of gathering eggs from the chicken coop with serious daily responsibility, and Clara, at 2.5, provided the primary entertainment of the household through the sheer vigor of her opinions about everything. The baby was born in October of 1889, another boy, and they named him David, and he came into the world with a calm that contrasted so thoroughly with Henry's opinionated arrival that Stephen looked at him for a long moment and then said, "He is going to be a surprise," which turned out to be entirely accurate. 3 children on a working ranch in the New Mexico Territory in 1889 was a life of very little boredom and very great richness, measured not in ease but in fullness. The mornings were loud, and the days were long, and the evenings had a particular quality of earned rest that Rosa had not experienced in the hard, solitary years, and that she valued now with the fullness of someone who knows the difference. She and Stephen found their quiet moments where they could, the early morning before the children woke, the evening after they were in bed, the Saturday afternoons when Leo or the Whitfields took the older two for a spell, and they were briefly alone in the house with only David's small sleeping presence as companion. These moments were not frequent, but they were full. One such evening, With the October stars burning over the mesa and the new baby sleeping in his cradle and Henry and Clara down the hall breathing in the deep, uncomplicated rhythm of children who have spent the day entirely and have nothing left to save, Rosa and Stephen sat on the porch with blankets over their laps and the coffee she had made strong and hot against the chill. "Do you remember what you told me the first time I came back?" he said. "The morning with the oats and the fish." "You told me the fence was down," she said. "Before that," he said, "you told me you did not need a hand." She smiled into her coffee. "I did not." "No," he agreed. "You absolutely did not." He paused. "I came back anyway." "You came back because you had already bought the fish," she said. "I came back because you were the most interesting person I had ever met," he said simply, "and I was not ready to ride away from that." Rosa was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark land and the bright stars and the solid outline of the mountains against the sky. "I am glad you are a foolish man," she said. "So am I," he said. He took her hand under the blanket, which he had been doing since October of 1882 in the quieter evenings, and she let him keep it, which she had been doing since October of 1882 in the quieter evenings. And that small repeated choice was its own kind of declaration, more durable and more certain than any single dramatic moment could have been. The world outside the ranch was changing in those years in the ways that the American West of the 1880s was perpetually, and sometimes violently changing. New Mexico territory was thick with the tensions of settlement and expansion, with the older land grant claims of Mexican and Spanish families being contested, and sometimes stolen outright by Anglo settlers with political connections and legal creativity. Rosa had known, growing up with a father who respected the older families and the Jicarilla Apache who still moved through the high country above Cimarron, that this land had a human history far older than the one she was living in, and that the injustices being done to those whose land it had been first were real and consequential, and not talked about nearly enough in the Cimarron courthouse or the territorial newspaper. Elio's family had lost a section of their original land grant in a dispute that Rosa suspected had been decided in ways that had nothing to do with legal merit, and Stephen had been the one to suggest, gently and without making it a large pronouncement, that if Elio ever needed a character reference for any future legal claim, the Brenners were prepared to provide one. Elio had received this quietly and said he would remember it, and Rosa had looked at Stephen afterward and thought, not for the first time, that she had married the right man. They were not people of political power or great wealth. They could not fix what was being done broadly. But they could be decent in the specific, immediate ways that were available to them, and they were. The ranch turned 12 cattle to 28 by 1890, and the reputation of Brenner cattle in the Cimarron Valley was solid enough that they had begun receiving buyers who came specifically for their animals, not just selling at the general market. Stephen had developed a careful breeding program, selecting for both hardiness in the high desert conditions and for the quality of the beef, and the results were visible in the animals and in the prices they were bringing. Rosa managed the financial side with the organized intelligence she had always had, and that had been refined now by nearly a decade of actual ranch accounting, and the ledger that she kept with such satisfaction told, by 1890, a story very different from the desperate summer of 1882 when 3 cattle and a dying mortgage had been the whole of it. They were not rich. They were not trying to be rich. They were solvent and growing and building something that would outlast them, and that was the right kind of ambition. Henry was 7 in 1891 and already riding alone in the near pastures, and Clara was 5 and more interested in what was growing in the garden than in what was grazing in the field, and David was 2 and universally adored by everyone on the ranch, including Chester the mule, who suffered David's small, determined attentions with a forbearance that he extended to very few creatures. Stephen taught Henry to read the sky for weather in the way that a rancher must, watching the cloud formations and the wind behavior, and the temperature patterns that preceded storms. And Rosa sat with Clara in the garden, explaining which plants wanted what from the soil and what the color of a leaf could tell you about what a plant needed. And these transmissions of knowledge were themselves a kind of joy, the deep satisfaction of passing on the understanding that you had worked to acquire. On a warm June evening in 1891, Rosa was in the garden with Clara when Stephen came out of the stable and across the yard and stopped at the garden fence and looked at her with something in his face that she had learned to read as something important. "Pete Whitfield came by," he said. She stood up. Dolores Whitfield had been unwell since spring, a persistent difficulty with her lungs that the doctor had not been optimistic about. "She passed this morning," Stephen said. "Peaceful." Pete was with her. Rosa closed her eyes for a moment. Clara, sensing something solemn, went very quiet beside her. "I will go to Pete this evening," Rosa said. "We will go," Stephen said. They went that evening, all of them, and they brought food and company, and the children's honest, uncomplicated presents, which Pete Whitfield received with the shattered gratitude of a man in grief who nevertheless has not lost his capacity for love. He held David on his knee through most of the evening, and accepted Henry's awkward, sincere condolences with a dignity that taught the boy something about how to receive grief as well as how to offer comfort. Dolores Whitfield was buried in the Cimarron cemetery, and Rosa planted a cutting from the garden rose against the cemetery fence in her memory, because Dolores had always said she liked that rose best. Life on the ranch continued to move through its seasons with the relentless, honest rhythm of land that does not stop requiring your attention because you are grieving or celebrating or afraid. The work was the continuity, and Rosa had understood that since the beginning, had understood it from her father who had worked through his own losses with the same disciplined devotion to the daily necessity. But the work was no longer what it had been in those first solitary years. It was shared now, not just divided but genuinely shared, in the way of two people who have grown so accustomed to working together that the division of labor has become invisible, simply the natural movement of two parts of one larger whole. In the autumn of 1892, with Henry nearly 9 and Clara 6 and David 3, and the ranch running 31 head of cattle, and a stable of 4 horses and Chester still improbably present and functional, Rosa sat at the kitchen table with the ledger for the year and looked at the numbers for a long time. Then she called Stephen in from the yard. He came in dusty and warm from the afternoon's work and poured himself water and looked at her expression, which was the one she wore when something had resolved clearly. "What is it?" he said. "We are going to make an offer on the North 40, she said. "The Alderman parcel. Old Alderman has been thinking about selling it since his son moved to Santa Fe. It connects our east boundary to the creek extension. It would give us proper range for 50 head and room for the herd to grow another decade." Stephen sat down and she turned the ledger so he could see the numbers. He looked them over, slow and thorough the way he did everything, and she watched him work through it. "We have enough," he said. "We have exactly enough," she said. "It will be tight the first year." "When has it not been?" he said, not as a complaint but as a simple acknowledgement of the life they had chosen and its consistent character. "Never," she agreed. "Then we make the offer," he said, and she saw that expression she had seen since the very beginning, the lopsided ease of a man who was not afraid of the gamble when he had thought it through. "You realize," she said, "that if this works we will be a serious ranch." "Were we not serious before?" he said. "We were tenacious before," she said. "There is a difference." He smiled at that. "Make the offer, Rosa." They made the offer. Old Alderman took it in October, pleased to sell to people who would work the land rather than speculate on it. And in November of 1892, the Brenner Ranch had 100 acres of good New Mexico range and a herd that would grow to fill it. Standing at the new boundary line with Stephen in the late November afternoon, the cold air bright and sharp, and the mountains clear on the horizon, Rosa said, "My father bought the original 40 in 1868. He would have liked this." "He would have," Stephen said. "He was that kind of man, the kind who likes watching things grow." "He was," she said. You would have gotten along. I would have tried, Stephen said. And he would have tested me at least twice before deciding, and I would have respected him for it. Rosa laughed, which was the right response because it was entirely accurate, and the sound of it went out across the new land in the cold, clear air, and the mountains did not mind it at all. Henry began proper school in Cimarron that fall, riding in with Leo on the mornings when the weather allowed, and he attacked learning with the same determined energy he brought to everything else, returning home in the evenings with opinions about his teacher that were expressed with a directness his teacher might not have appreciated, but that his parents found difficult not to be amused by. Clara was in her second year of school by then, quieter in the classroom than her brother but consistently more accurate, and her teacher had written to Rosa in a note that was carefully diplomatic about Henry but not diplomatic at all about Clara, calling her one of the most perceptive students she had taught in the Cimarron school's 8 years of operation. Rosa kept that note in the back of the ledger, which was where she kept the things that mattered most. David, at 4, had decided that he wanted to be a mule, specifically Chester, and was going through a phase of this conviction that everyone on the ranch was managing with varying degrees of patience. Stephen was the most patient about it, as Stephen was the most patient about most things, responding to David's assertions about his mule nature with the same careful seriousness he brought to Henry's opinions about the sky or Clara's assessments of the soil. And Rosa watched this and thought, not for the first time, that whatever she had given her children by choosing this man, it was no small thing. The spring of 1893 brought something they had not planned for, which was the arrival of a letter from a woman named Margaret Caldwell in Kansas City, who turned out to be Stephen's older sister, from whom he had been separated in the family upheaval that followed their parents' deaths when he was 16. The letter had been forwarded through 3 different post offices over 18 months, tracking Stephen's movements through a series of towns, until it finally caught up with the Cimarron address. Stephen read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in March, and Rosa watched his face as he read it, the way something very old and very careful unlocked in it, like a door that has been stuck for a long time and finally, with the right amount of patient effort, gives. He folded the letter and set it down and was quiet for a moment. "She has 3 children," he said. "Her husband is a clockmaker. She has been looking for me for 4 years. Right back today," Rosa said. He looked at her. "Yes, Stephen," she said gently. "Yes." He wrote back that afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with Henry's school paper because they had run out of proper letter paper, using an ink Rosa made herself from oak gall and iron sulfate, and he wrote 4 pages, and Rosa did not read them because they were his to say. Margaret Caldwell came to Cimarron in the summer of 1893, with her husband Harold and their 3 children on the train from Kansas City to Raton, and then the stage to Cimarron. And she was a tall woman with Stephen's brown eyes and a directness that immediately made sense to Rosa. And they met her in the dusty stage yard in Cimarron, and Stephen's face, when he saw his sister walk off the stage, was the face of a man being handed back something he had given up ever having. Rosa stood back and let them have their moment, and then she shook Margaret's hand and said, "We have room and the bed is made up. You will stay the week." Margaret looked at her with those same brown eyes and said, "Stephen's letters about you did not do you justice." "What did his letters say?" Rosa asked. "That you were the most capable person he had ever met," Margaret said, "and that he had been entirely foolish about you for a very long time before you agreed to be foolish back." Rosa looked at Stephen, who had the grace to look mildly embarrassed. "That is a fairly accurate summary," Rosa said. Margaret stayed 10 days, not the 1 week, and Harold was quiet and precise, and repairing the kitchen clock on the 2nd day because he could not help himself. And the children, 2 boys and a girl, integrated into the ranch routine with the natural ease of children who are curious and confident. And Henry was deeply pleased to have older company, and Clara appointed herself guide to the garden, with an authority that the Kansas City children received entirely seriously. When Margaret left, she held Rosa's hands on the stage platform and said, "You gave him somewhere to be. You have no idea what that means." "I think I do," Rosa said. "He gave me the same." She watched the stage pull away and felt something that had nothing to do with loss and everything to do with gratitude. Stephen came to stand beside her, watching the dust. "All right," she said. "Better than all right," he said. They drove home along the Cimarron road in the afternoon light, and the children were arguing in the back of the wagon about something that had the logic and consequence of children's arguments, which is to say very little logic and enormous consequence. And the ranch was visible ahead, the main house and the stable and the expanded fence lines, and the good green of the south pasture by the creek. 10 years since a bleeding cowboy had appeared at her gate asking for water for his horse. 10 years since she had tied a bandage around his head with efficient hands and told herself very firmly he was not her problem. 10 years of accounts and cattle and children and hard seasons and good seasons and everything in between. Rosa looked at the ranch coming toward her in the afternoon sun and felt the full weight and richness of it. This improbable life built out of stubbornness and grief, and one very determined drifter who had decided, for reasons he had never entirely explained, that this particular fence line in this particular part of New Mexico was worth caring about. She had told him love was a foolish gamble. She had been right about that. She had been right about it in the way of someone who is looking very carefully at the risk and not quite carefully enough at the return. Henry jumped off the back of the wagon before it had fully stopped, because Henry was 9, and that was what 9-year-olds did, and received a sharp word from his father that he acknowledged with the maximum degree of contrition the moment required and no more. And David fell asleep against Clara's shoulder in the way that 4-year-olds fall asleep, suddenly and completely, and Clara held him with the particular competent tenderness that she brought to everything she cared about. Stephen helped Rosa down from the wagon seat, both hands, the formal and careful way he had helped her up onto it every morning for 10 years, and she stood in the yard of the ranch that bore her name first and his second and that belonged to them both in every way that mattered. "Come inside," she said. "I will make supper." "I will help," he said. "You always do," she said. She went in and he followed, and the door closed behind them, and the evening came down over the New Mexico mesa in all its colors, rose and copper, and a deep particular blue, and the coyotes would begin their calling soon, and the stars would come out in their thousands, and somewhere in the house a child would need something and the stove would be warm and the lamp would be lit. And it was none of it dramatic, none of it what she had imagined as a girl when she thought about how a life ought to look. It was better than imagined. It was specific and honest and entirely hers, and the man in the kitchen making terrible jokes at Chester's expense through the open window was hers too, and had been for the better part of a decade, and would be for all the decades that followed this one. The biggest fool alive, he had said. She had since concluded that the biggest fool alive was the one who would have said no. She had not been that fool. She had been the other kind entirely. And standing in her kitchen in the fading light of a summer evening in Cimarron, New Mexico territory, in the year 1893, with 3 children and 31 cattle and 1 ancient mule and 1 man who had shown up bleeding and grinning on a July morning, and never quite left, Rosa Prescott Brenner felt, in the uncomplicated whole of her chest, that the gamble had paid out more richly than she had ever had the imagination to hope for. She put on the kettle. She called the children in. She began the small, certain evening of her life.